All right, everybody. Welcome, welcome, hello, and welcome. It is my privilege and honor to introduce this panel that is a collaboration between the Anti-War Working Group, the Political Education Working Group, and the International Committee's Middle East and Africa subcommittee. I'm a very big fan of all the panelists, who I will be reading their bios in a moment. But I do want to do something. I told my co-organizers I would do this. It's something that's become very unpopular and passe, but especially since like the DNC does it while they're actively engaged in genocide against indigenous people. But I do think it's important to recognize that we are on Lenape land that has been taken actually in a raid that occurred while the villagers were sleeping in the 1600s. There's more details to be looked up on that. And I say that because we are, as a country, partners in the genocide in Gaza. We are partners in the genocidal violence in Lebanon and Syria. I think it's imperative politically to see that in the lineage of the genocide against indigenous people here, and to look at the Palestinian struggle not just as something that we support and are in solidarity with, but something we are students of, because there are national liberation struggles that need to happen on this continent as well, against our settler colony. Thank you for bearing with me. I think we need to take those back, land acknowledgements, but so to get to our panelists, we have on screen Lara Deeb, a professor of anthropology and Middle Eastern studies at Scripps College. In addition to numerous articles and chapters, Deeb is the author of 4 books, 2 of which are based on field research in the southern suburbs of Beirut, and Enchanted Modern, which kind of changed my whole outlook on the world, and Leisurely Islam. Her most recent book was just published in fall of 2024 and is titled Love Across Difference, Mixed Marriage in Lebanon. She has also co-authored a primer on Lebanon with Middle East Report, written for policymakers and the general educated public. It is available online. Maya Mikdashi is a associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at the director of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. Maya's work focuses on state and archival power, sexual and political difference, settler colonialism and law, religion and secularism. Her first book, Sectarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon, won the 2023 Gregory Bateson Book Prize and the Fatima Mernissi Book Award, the AMEWS Book Prize, and the LGBTQ Caucus Book Award at the ISA, and received honorable mention in the Michelle Rosaldo Book Prize. Maya sits on the editorial collectives of the Journal of Palestinian Studies, the Social Text, and she is a co-founding editor of Jadaliyah. She is a co-director of the documentary film About Baghdad, filmed in Iraq, and director of Notes on the War, filmed in Lebanon. Maya's work has been translated into Arabic, Turkish, Farsi, Spanish, French, German, Korean, and Portuguese. Ziad Abu-Rish is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Human Rights at Bard College, a historian by training. His research interests focus on state formation, economic development, and the popular movement in the Levant, Lebanon, and Jordan in particular. He is the author of several articles and book chapters and is co-editor of The Dawn of the Arab Uprisings, End of an Old Order? ? He serves as co-editor of Arab Studies Journal and Jadaliyah Ezine. These 3 illustrious panelists will be moderated by Seamus Malekafzali, a journalist and writer focusing on politics in the Middle East. His work features in The Nation, The Intercept, The Baffler, among other publications. He is based in Beirut. He was based in Beirut until September of this year. Thank you all.
So I wanted to, of course, thank DSA NYC for asking me to speak before all of you tonight and to moderate this discussion with such lovely and intelligent people. When I was initially asked to speak here, we were very much still in the throes. We were still in the throes of this war that was being waged against Lebanon by the State of Israel. And we were caught between this sense of immense despair at the destruction that we were seeing, both in Gaza and in Beirut. But we were also consumed by this feeling that we were potentially watching the formation of a new kind of order or a new kind of world. Something uncharted and something that could potentially put an end to the humiliation that this region had felt since 1948. Lebanon had been, for the most part, alone through many of the wars that it had fought against Israeli occupation. But now things were somewhat different. Drones were being fired from Iraq by people who were waving Lebanese flags, and those drones were reaching settlements in Israel's north. Hypersonic missiles, technology that was possessed by very few powers in this world, were now in the hands of the poorest nation in the Middle East, and they were being thrown at Israeli military bases under the understanding that they would not stop being thrown until the aggression against Lebanon stopped. Hundreds of ballistic missiles were being fired by Iran in retaliation for the killings of Arab leaders, for Palestinian leaders who had been killed on Iranian soil. Then, suddenly out of the blue, there's a ceasefire. And now there is all of this uncertainty as things seem to come to this grinding halt. An entire gigantic piece of the axis of resistance, which was seemingly on a path of endless strengthening, now falls. The Israeli army continues to occupy South Lebanon and seems to be preparing to break the ceasefire and restart this war. And the path that it is forging to reshape the Middle East in its own image continues to be unfettered. All of these dynamics are unfortunately not given their proper due here in the Western discourse. They're oversimplified into sectarian narratives and the concerns of the people who are affected by Western policy are not given any sort of serious analysis. My hope is that this panel here illustrates some of the things that are left out of this discussion, things that I think are necessary to be discussed here in the Imperial Core. Thank you.
Is that my cue?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I just didn't want to speak out of turn. Thank you very much for the invitation to be joining you all. And I apologize for not being able to be there in person due to some personal circumstances today. And thank you very much to the organizers. And it's always a pleasure and a learning moment for me to be in the company of Maya and Lara. And I hope we can collectively come out of here with a little bit more clarity. I've been tasked potentially as the historian, although I would consider Maya and Lara to be equally adept at the history as I am, to kind of lay out the maybe historical trajectory and background to U.S. Relations policy with Lebanon and the same with Israel. So my goal really is to provide a framework rather than get into a long chronology, of which there are quite a few successful attempts at. I also want to plug the primer that Lara and company worked on, which I think is must read for anyone that wants to understand what is happening. For those that are less familiar with the history of Lebanon more generally, allow me to just start by saying that Lebanon as a state was actually created in the aftermath of World War I, as many successor states to the Ottoman Empire were. So think of Jordan, think of Iraq, think of Syria, think of Palestine, and we know, or we've heard quite a bit about that kind of history of how the territories were occupied and divided and partitioned and so on and so forth. But for our purposes, Lebanon gains independence officially from France in 1943, and thus inaugurates what many would consider its post-colonial history. Though, as we know from the history of Lebanon and many other parts of the region, the term post-colonial is problematic given the persistence of colonial and imperial relations in the region, not just by formal colonial powers, but by new and emerging colonial powers. In terms of the political history of Lebanon, I just want to flag a couple of milestones that are important for our story here today, and that will be reference points and touch points for much of what myself, Lara, and Amaya will be speaking about. Between 1975 and 1990, there was what is known as the Lebanese Civil War. Whether it was one war or a series of war or a variety of dynamics in different parts of the country is subject to the kind of analytical debates about it. But I think this is a really important a juncture in our story, and we'll be coming back to it quite regularly. And so when we talk about the post-Civil War period in Lebanon, we're really talking about post-1990, which is very important. So with that, I just want to get into a little bit about the details of US policy and Israeli policy in Lebanon and provide you with a little bit of framework. The starting point of US policy and US relationships of substance and of consequence with Lebanon really began during World War II, at a time when the United States is trying to support French and British efforts in the Middle East as part of the broader post-World War II Allied war effort. But we really see the United States start to have a direct role and a direct relationship in the ways that we've come to understand it in the aftermath of World War II. Lebanon serves as a critical node for the exercise of US power in the Levant, in the Middle East, and globally as it is emerging from World War II as a major global power, superseding many of its allies in the form of Britain and France. Now, in general, in the region, but also in Lebanon, the interests and objectives guiding US policy at the time were very well articulated in a book by Irene Ganzier and other scholars, but were basically organized around the themes of petroleum, aviation, commerce, labor, and intelligence. And Lebanon was a critical node for the furthering of US interests along those axes, both in the immediate vicinity and across the Middle East. And so we really need to understand Lebanon as not some kind of sideshow to US policy and US empire in the Middle East, but as a main battleground, if you will, a main arena of intervention and of US empire building. Now, by 1958, the United States has become a status quo power, meaning that it has linked its fate to the fate of many of the status quo regimes in the region. But in addition to this, to the regime that is in place in Lebanon, both before 1958, but also after 1958. It is the uncontested Western power in Lebanon and in the region, and it has become intimately engaged in the internal affairs and politics of Lebanon and attempting to shape them. And here I just want to briefly pause at 1958 in which there was a armed rebellion or civil war, depending on your analytic lens, and the United States directly intervenes and lands 14,000 Marines into Lebanon during 1958, with the consequence of preventing the victory of the armed rebels and the overthrow of the existing regime, with the consequence of shaping the future political landscape of Lebanon by supporting and shaping who comes to power, both in the presidency of Fuad Shahab and subsequent cabinet formations, and the introduction of some major new US financial and intelligence infrastructure and interests in the area. Now, from then on, from 1958 onwards, I would argue that the United States' role in Lebanon is, one, to maintain the status quo that it helped establish in 1958, to prevent the emergence of radical movements and progressive radical movements at that would threaten the status quo in Lebanon or in the region, including the Palestinian National Liberation Movement in all its guises, and it would intervene into Lebanon covertly or directly as it saw fit. And we see this most notably, of course, during the Lebanese Civil War, where in 1982, the United States actually lands a group of Marines and then will reinforce those Marines in 1983, establishing a barracks, maintaining a particular balance of power, and directly intervening into the Lebanese civil war. And so I really think it's important to understand that with this intervention in the Lebanese civil war, the United States is not some kind of outside actor to the Lebanese war, but is a party to the Lebanese civil war in many ways, in the same way that the United States was a partner and a party to the war that we saw in Lebanon most recently, and that I would argue is continuing until today, because Israel continues to occupy territory in Lebanon. It is continuing to carry out military operations, and it is continuing to carry out strikes, even if at a level much more reduced than we came to be familiar with during the months of late September, October, and November. Allow me here to just switch gears a little bit to speak about Israel and its relationship to Lebanon. And I will just say that I think to understand Israel's relationship to Lebanon, we would need to understand it at two levels. On the one hand, there is a long history of Zionist expansionist thinking and strategic vision that really saw a part of Lebanon, if not all of Lebanon, as part of its greater Israel project. Many of the early Zionist movements, including subsequent leaders in the Israeli state post-1948, really understood the potential boundaries of the Jewish state that they were attempting to create to reach up to the Litani River in current-day Lebanon or even beyond this. But beyond this question of expansionism, and we see this question of expansionism reanimate itself every once in a while, including most recently when all of a sudden there were Israeli politicians and political movements that were frothing at the mouth to establish settlements or reclaim land or annex territory from Lebanon in the hopes of rebuilding this imagined greater Israel. But separate from this expansionism, it's also important to understand that Israeli policy towards Lebanon has been shaped by directly intervening in the domestic politics of the Lebanese state and Lebanese politics. This also started very early on when the Zionist movement was championing the idea of Lebanon as a Christian state, as a state that can serve as a bulwark for quote unquote Western civilization and the projection of Western power in many ways that it saw itself as doing. But it also, especially after 1948 and the Nakba and displacement of Palestinians and the attempt to totally repress Palestinian resistance to the new status quo, it intervened directly in Lebanon to make impossible any kind of challenge to its project in Palestine or in the region. And by this, I mean by repressing, first and foremost, Palestinian radical progressive liberation movements, but also domestic Lebanese radical progressive liberation movements that would maybe potentially upend the status quo in Lebanon, which could then serve as a bridgehead for supporting and endorsing the Palestinian cause. We saw this as early as 1948 with the Hula massacre, when Israel occupied almost 15 villages in southern Lebanon. But we've seen it since, and most dramatically, of course, in 1978, which is called the first Israeli invasion in official historiography, where we saw the justification for the invasion to be to repress and repel Palestinian Liberation Organization-led attacks against Israel. Again, this discourse of defense and defensiveness, yet the invasion actually resulted in the killing of over 2,000 civilians and the displacement of over 250,000 people and the establishment of the beginning of a long-term Israeli occupation, which was then supplemented in the 1982 Israeli invasion, which reached all the way up to Beirut. And while Israel withdrew from a large part of those territories in 1985, it continued to occupy 10 to 15% of southern Lebanon, an occupation that continued until 2000 and ended only as a result of the intense resistance operations of Hezbollah, which I know Lara will be speaking about later on. Beyond this 1978 and 1982, Israel has repeatedly bombarded different parts of Lebanon. Israel has repeatedly invaded different parts of Lebanon. Israel has repeatedly carried out covert and direct intelligence operations to undermine politics in Lebanon in such a way as to prevent the formation of any kind of polity that would actually orient itself to the region and to Palestine in particular. So these are a couple of the examples that I would say are important to understand the broad historical trajectory. And if we wanted to summarize it in a simple way, I think we have to acknowledge that the relationship between the United States and Lebanon, or between Israel and Lebanon, is a structural relationship in a global balance of power. For Israel, it is a settler colonial state on Palestinian land, and it has a settler colonial project vis-a-vis Palestine and Palestinians. But yet it must, or understands that it must support and supplement that settler colonial process by being a regional dominant military power and having a critical advantage militarily over all other states and all other non-state actors. And so if you really want to understand what Israel is doing in Lebanon, I think you have to understand it in terms of maintaining its military dominance in the region and trying to make sure that it is never loses its deterrence capacity to maintain itself and to continue on with its project. The United States, on the other hand, is an empire, and its actions in Lebanon are largely guided by the fact that it is a global empire, and it manifests itself in the Middle East in particular ways, and in Lebanon in even more particular ways. And of course, we can have a longer discussion about the relationship between these two relationships and these two projects. And I think we saw that quite clearly in September, October, and November of 2024. I will end here to turn it over to my colleagues and look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ziad. And thank you, first of all, to everyone who's later pulled this event together and for inviting us to speak with you. And inviting me to speak with you with these two amazing comrades. And I want to also note that Maya is one of the co-authors of the primer that has now been mentioned a couple of times as well. So as I think you know, or as Ziad just mentioned, I'll be talking mostly about Hezbollah. And I want to start actually by re-emphasizing a key overarching point from the history that you just heard, which is, you know, just as the ongoing genocide in Gaza did not begin last October, Israeli violence against Lebanon did not begin with the founding of Hezbollah in the 1980s, right? It began with the Israeli state's inception. And as Ziad mentioned, the first Israeli massacre of civilians in Lebanon took place during the Nakba in 1948. And what we actually saw in October of this year was the desecration of the memorial to the victims of that massacre. So Hezbollah was formed after, and not only after, but in direct response to the Israeli invasions of both 1978 and 1982, right? So it was formed, in other words, explicitly to fight the Israeli occupiers. There was resistance to the Israeli invasions from the start, including in 1948, And in the 1970s, the PLO led much of that resistance. And then in the 1980s, the form of the resistance shifted. And the two most important reasons for that shift, there's many reasons, but the two most important reasons for the shift in the leadership and form of resistance were, first of all, the 1978-79 Islamic Revolution in Iran, because that provided a model of resistance to the post-World War II US-dominated geopolitical order that did not rely on a Soviet model of communism. It provided a model rooted in values that resonated with Muslims around the world. And the second factor here was the 1982 evacuation of the PLO from Lebanon during the Israeli siege on Beirut. So in the early 1980s, in this context, the groups you had before this small groups of, mostly young men who were fighting the Israeli occupation of their villages, of their homes. These groups coalesced around an Islamic ideology that was inspired by the revolution in Iran. In 1984, they had a series of meetings and came together and formed Hezbollah to be the primary resistance force that would fight the Israeli troops that had invaded Lebanon and were still occupying. In 1985, they announced their existence publicly as a group in a manifesto. And since then, Hezbollah has led the resistance. That doesn't mean it's the only resistance contingent in Lebanon, it's not. But it has grown into the most organized and established of the contingents. The 1980s is also when Hezbollah landed on the US terrorist list, and I want to say just a little bit about that. Hezbollah is associated with attacks on the US Marine barracks and the embassy in Beirut in 1983, which you'll note was actually before Hezbollah officially existed. Those attacks were claimed by a group called Islamic Jihad, which the United States claims is a branch of Hezbollah. And whether or not the same people who went on to form Hezbollah were involved with those attacks is not the point. What's important is the context for those attacks. And Ziad gave you a bit of this context already. As he mentioned, the US sent Marines to Lebanon in 1982, right, to do two things: to supervise the evacuation of the PLO from the country and to support the US's allies in the Lebanese Civil War, who were the right-wing, primarily Maronite Christian Phalange Party led by the Jmeyo family and its Lebanese Forces militia. Those same allies, the Phalange and Lebanese forces, are the same groups that perpetrated the horrific Sabra and Shatila massacres of thousands of Palestinian and Lebanese civilians in 1982, while the Israeli army that was surrounding the camp at the time watched and let them in. And those are the same political groups that the US is allying with right now in Lebanon. So there's a historical continuity to the groups and people that the United States is supporting, propping up. Then in 1983, the US sent additional Marine battalions, plus a US Army battalion to Lebanon. So prior to the attacks on Americans, the US had sent in Marines and the Army, set up barracks on Lebanese soil, and could be interpreted as an occupying military force. The car bombing of the US Embassy in April of that year killed 17 US personnel, 8 of whom were CIA members, and tens of Lebanese who worked there. That summer, US warships began shelling Beirut and the surrounding mountains. So at this point, the US is an absolutely active participant in the war. US troops exchanged direct artillery fire with various militias, and there's at least one report of the US using F-14 fighter planes against targets in Lebanon at that point. That October, Shia fighters drove trucks full of explosives into the US Army barracks in Beirut and blew it up, killing 241 US soldiers. So this is one of the reasons, in addition to the US-Israeli relationship, this is the other big reason that Hezbollah has a special place on the State Department's terrorist list. This is also why the CIA, for example, authorized an off-the-books assassination attempt of the prominent Shia religious leader, Sayyid Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, via a car bomb that exploded near his home in 1985. So again, the point here is that the context for the 1983 attacks is this history of active US engagement in Lebanon and active US military participation in the Lebanese Civil War. And that context tends to get left out of the narrative that we hear, at least the corporate media narrative. Okay, so the Lebanese Civil War is obviously ongoing at the time that Hezbollah formed. And during the Civil War, most Lebanese political parties converted into militias. When the war ended in 1990, those militias reverted back to being political parties. And Hezbollah had emerged for the first time during the Civil War, right? So when it ended, they made the deliberate decision to become a political party like the other parties in Lebanon. In other words, they decided to become a group that works within the systems and processes of the Lebanese state, like all the other groups in the country. And since 1992, Hezbollah has participated in elections, municipal and parliamentary elections, and has done quite well. And since 2005, the party has held cabinet positions in the government. As it grew as a political party, Hezbollah also grew imbricated in all of the political maneuvers that every Lebanese political party participates in, right? So we also need to remember that the context for this is that Lebanon's a functional democracy, where elections happen regularly and perhaps more robustly than they do here in the US. And in those elections, Hezbollah has been very, very successful. There are many reasons why people support them, including because they support the resistance, because they think Hezbollah will protect their interests in a sectarian system, because they want to oppose the US support of other groups in Lebanon, because they appreciate the party's welfare organizations that I'll say more about in a minute, because they're pious Muslims and support the party's values, because other people they know vote for them, right? So just like how people vote here, it's very complicated and there's multiple reasons. And just like all political parties, support for them rises and falls depending on what else is going on. Their popularity skyrockets across many different Lebanese communities when they defend Lebanon against Israeli attacks, which again have happened regularly since the establishment of the Israeli state. The high point of their popularity across the country and the region was in 2000, when the resistance made the Israeli occupation of the South so costly that the occupiers withdrew. But their internal political stances in Lebanon have been deeply divisive, meaning that by 2008, we can safely say that Hezbollah was both the most popular and the least popular political party in Lebanon, depending on who you asked. People were also divided about their involvement supporting the regime in Syria after 2012. But also key here is that many Lebanese who really dislike their internal politics absolutely support their resistance against Israeli violence on Lebanon, right? So it's not necessarily always an either or perspective for many people. Okay, so in addition to being a strong political party and maintaining the resistance, since the early 1990s, Hezbollah has also built a massive social welfare network. And again, they're not the only group in Lebanon to do this, but they're the most institutionalized. That welfare network is important because it fills the complete absence of any such network from the Lebanese state. So here, Hezbollah functions as an umbrella organization under which you have many, many institutions. You have welfare organizations, orphanages, hospitals, low-cost clinics, schools. There's an organization of engineers and construction workers that's actually leading the rebuilding right now, an institution for the disabled. And many people work for those organizations or use their services. And that includes people who are not Shia Muslim, and that includes people who are not Lebanese. And many of these civilian organizations, right, these institutions upon which hundreds of thousands of people rely, were targeted and destroyed by the Israeli bombardment this fall. So for example, one of them, Al-Qanat al-Hassan, is an Islamic bank or a financial institution that makes loans without interest that's affiliated with the party. And some 300,000 people, not only Lebanese, some 300,000 people rely on the microcredit loans it provides. It's literally the largest micro lender in the country. So again, the key point of all of this is that Hezbollah is part of Lebanese society in multiple ways. It isn't something you can pull out of it. Another of those organizations, the engineering and construction one I mentioned, Jihad al-Binat, is led the rebuilding of the southern suburbs and much of the south after the 2006 war on Lebanon, and it's likely going to do so again now. They've already begun trying to assess damage in the southern suburbs of Beirut, for example. So in 2006, the 33-day long Israeli war on Lebanon caused $3 billion worth of infrastructural damage in Lebanon. Right now, early estimates suggest that the infrastructural damage may be as high as $40 billion. And what that number doesn't capture is, in addition, of course, to the loss of human life, which it doesn't capture, it also doesn't capture the ongoing housing crisis this has created. So many displaced people have no standing homes to return to. Many who have returned home are living in buildings that are damaged and are not structurally sound. It's winter, which means it's cold and raining and there's floods. It also doesn't capture the ways that histories and memories are destroyed with the destruction of places, right? Because places are more than their structures, they carry meaning, whether through one person's life, a family's life, or a long historical trajectory. It doesn't capture the destruction of heritage or material histories, things like century-old souks or places of worship, educational institutions or medical facilities. And it doesn't capture the long-term environmental devastation caused by the munitions that Israel has used. We talk a lot about Beirut, but we have to remember other parts of the country, and especially, not only, but especially the south, where the Israeli military has essentially blanketed South Lebanon with white phosphorus, which is an illegal chemical weapon. And it's just one example of the many kinds of chemical pollutants left by the bombs that the US has provided to Israel. And these are pollutants that remain in the soil and water for generations, right? So we're talking about the loss of agricultural productivity. We're talking about cancer and birth defects. We're talking about the kinds of impacts that we've also seen in other places like Iraq after the US invasion and war on Iraq and occupation of Iraq, right? So that's okay. So then I guess there's one more thing I want to say before I pass this on to Maya, which brings us back to Hezbollah's resistance in relation specifically to Israeli colonial violence in the region. After the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon, the Israeli general in charge of the Northern Command at the time, his name was Gadi Eisenkot, he named the level of destruction in 2006 the Dahya Doctrine, because the southern suburb of Beirut, which was greatly destroyed at that war, is known as Dahya, which just means suburb in Arabic. Eisenkot explained that the Dahya Doctrine explicitly called for the use of massive disproportionate force against civilian infrastructure. And he stated that the Israeli military views civilian villages, buildings, and other infrastructure as military bases. Now, of course, 2006 is not the first time the Israeli military targets civilians and civilian infrastructure. The entire history of Israeli colonization in Palestine demonstrates that, but they named it this time as an explicit strategy. And this is also, of course, the way that the US has waged war against Iraq and Afghanistan by deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure. The US is much more oblique about it. They don't name it and describe it as one of their policies, but it is what they do, and it provides the Israeli military cover, because then they can say to their ally, well, you do this, so why can't we? What's been happening, though, since October 2023 is an escalation of that Dahya Doctrine, and some people are calling it the Gaza Doctrine, because instead of killing civilians by targeting civilian infrastructure, the Israeli military is targeting civilians themselves. This is why the deaths and destruction in Lebanon since last October, and especially this fall, are exponentially greater than in 2006. And that degree of scaling up was enabled by the impunity with which the Dahya Doctrine was allowed to destroy Lebanon in 2006. We're also seeing that impunity now in the sheer number of times the Israeli military has already blatantly violated the alleged ceasefire in Lebanon, killing additional people, destroying additional infrastructure, again with absolute impunity. So rather than a ceasefire, what we have is this sort of movement and recontainment of Israeli violence to South Lebanon and away from Beirut, but not an end to any of it. And all of this, of course, begs the question of where the impunity with which Israel continues to carry out a genocide, invade its neighbors, and steal territory is going to lead us next. And that is where I will stop and pass this to Maya.
I just want to start by thanking you all for coming on a very cold night to have this conversation. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me and to be with my friends and colleagues speaking with you tonight. I always use three scales when I think about Lebanon or think about any sort of political, historical context. That is the national, the regional, and the international. And really sort of focusing on how these three scales are imbricated, but are not always coherent. Meaning there is movement and agency at each of these scales and periods of recalibration, friction, and even realignment. The ongoing war and genocide is one of these inflection points. So first, I just want to mention a few foundational points about the Lebanese structure. So this would be the first slide. Lebanon, as Lara was saying, is a parliamentary democracy that holds regular and contested elections. There are caveats, like every system, that we can talk about in the Q&A. Lebanese parliamentary seats are divided equally between Muslim and Christian MPs of various political persuasions and alliances. One of the ways that Hezbollah is very successful in elections is very good at making alliances, electoral alliances. Executive power in Lebanon is divided to three positions. By custom, these are represented by three different religious sects, the three largest ones. The highest public offices, meaning posts like army commander or the head of the judiciary, first president of the cassation court, are also divided by sect. These were supposed to end, these practices were supposed to end after the civil war in a sort of, but they haven't been implemented yet, these reforms. This is a system that political scientists call pacted democracy. In the case of Lebanon, political sectarianism, run through political sectarianism. This is a secular system that's meant to achieve representation for all of Lebanon's religious groups. Officially, Lebanon is a country of minorities, and it's very invested in being a country of minorities. The system itself structures and is structured by a kind of demographic anxiety to keep this kind of equilibrium and political administrative practice. This is really an important note to keep in mind when it comes to Syrian and Palestinian refugees and their treatment in Lebanon. Lebanon has a similar demographic anxiety as Israel, except that it's about maintaining equilibrium, not about domination, about one ethnic groups above the other. The Lebanese constitution here guarantees, and I think it's important to note this because everyone in America hears constantly that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. So the Lebanese constitution guarantees the right to free expression and assembly, religious freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of association. It explicitly defines Lebanon as the equal final homeland of all its citizens, and it explicitly gives citizens the right to live anywhere in the country, meaning it is actually illegal and unconstitutional to bar anyone living anywhere based on an ethnic or religious difference. As you should see, the Lebanese constitution is much more liberal than the basic laws of Israel. So beginning there, I just want to, after giving that sort of superstructural, legal, constitutional context, I'm going to move a little bit to a very contemporary history that just goes from 2019 to today to really explain sort of how we got to where we are and really how to understand the absolute depravity of Israel targeting the social fabric of Lebanon in hopes of instigating civil violence and polarization. So we're going to go over sort of four things: an uprising, an economic collapse, port explosion, a hollowed out state, and then we're going to talk a little bit about who and what is Lebanon. Lebanon is one of the most diverse places, definitely in the region and perhaps even globally. It's a very diverse place. So, slide, please. Okay. So this is an image taken from October 21 of 2019. In 2019, the Lebanese central bank's financial engineering scheme, which had pegged the Lebanese pound to the US dollar, and this was part of also American policy, at the rate of 1,507 pounds to the dollar, collapsed. This peg collapsed. By that summer, the black market rate was about 10 times more. And in the early fall, the government began to implement austerity measures on a country that was already suffering financially. On October 17th of 2019, hundreds of thousands of Lebanese and non-Lebanese took to the streets declaring a revolution. The immediate triggers were a monthly tax on WhatsApp, which, if you know anything about, it's really dangerous stuff to put a tax on WhatsApp. The austerity measures and the spectacle of the government's failure to suppress devastating wildfires that had just occurred. There's a very long, decades-long genealogy that we can get into about uprisings, counter-uprisings in Lebanon, but we really don't have the time. But I do want to note sort of two things. First was the sort of the collapse of that dollar peg, and the second is that summer earlier, a protest movement in the refugee camps and among Palestinian refugees for more social and economic rights also took place with very, very large protests, including in the same location where many of the main protests, this location, which is downtown Beirut. And they were protesting for more social and economic rights in Lebanon after an attempt to further erode them by the Ministry of Labor. And it was called the Coalition for Palestinian Refugees' Right to Work. So beginning on October 17, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, went on strikes, blocked roads, and effectively paralyzed the country. The protests were really regional, cross-sectarian, expressly and multi-generational, and in certain actions were also involved sort of different socioeconomic classes. The main calls were for the overthrow of the current political class, the end of political sectarianism, and most pressingly, an end to the rampant corruption and the strengthening independence of state institutions and services, including electricity. And here I just want to note that the electrical grid has been bombed. The Lebanese electrical grid has been bombed by Lebanon several times. In my lifetime, I think I remember twice when we had 24-hour electricity. There was like a golden year in 1993, then the electrical grid got bombed. 96, there was another few golden months, then it was bombed again. So when we talk about the erosion of state institutions, we're also talking about a history of war and targeting of infrastructure, state infrastructure. The uprising was suppressed by the Lebanese state security forces, as well as groups of armed men from different sectarian parties, and was further weakened by growing polarization among protesters. Like everywhere else in the world, beginning in February 2020, the COVID pandemic really put an effective end to lingering protests, and the already suffering economy ground to a halt. So the takeaway here is that the current government and the political class lacks political legitimacy in Lebanon since then. Next slide. Okay. Against this backdrop, one of the largest ever non-nuclear explosions rocked Lebanon. On August 4th, 2020, some 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate stored in a warehouse at the Beirut port exploded, killing 219 people and injuring thousands and damaging hundreds of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people had to leave their homes. Most, for a little bit, but anyway. It caused extensive damage to multiple Beirut neighborhoods and rendered hundreds of thousands of people without homes. The destruction of the grain silos, which are in the back there, also contributed to bread shortages and widespread hunger. To date, nobody has been held accountable. A government and judicial investigation into the cause of the explosion rapidly became mired in political tensions and interventions from all sides of the Lebanese political spectrum. And here, again, the takeaway is exactly the sentiment that's here in the graffiti. The judicial system is severely compromised. The political class will always band together to evade accountability. And for the, again, this contributes to this, my government did this to my country and then evaded all responsibility. Next slide. Finally, in the wake of the revolution, the port explosion, and the pandemic, Lebanon's financial collapse accelerated rapidly, exacerbated by corruption in the banking sector and the states. Banks illegally cut off access to checking and savings accounts as inflation soared and the Lebanese pound devalued by 98%. The World Bank in 2021 warned that the economic crisis risked being one of the worst in modern history, and Lebanon was reclassified to a lower middle-income country from an upper middle-income country. Widespread shortages of basic necessities, including fuel and medicine, skyrocketing inflation, and a spike in unemployment followed. In February 2023, the Lebanese state officially unpegged the dollar from the pound, devaluing the official exchange rate, but it still didn't approach the black market rate. As of today, the pound has stabilized at around 89,000 pounds to the dollar. And I want to remind you, right, what I said in 2019, it was 1,500 pounds to the dollar. And this led to a huge wave of migration. Around 200,000 left Lebanon during these years. The two industries with the largest flight, and this is important during the time we're living in now, the education sector and the health sector. So facing inflation of over 200% and massive unemployment, most people in Lebanon today struggle to survive. People with bank accounts, themselves sort of a minority in the country, are only allowed, quote unquote, to withdraw $400 a month. This cumulative effect of all of these spiraling crises led to the extraordinary rise in multidimensional poverty for both Lebanese and non-citizen residents in Lebanon, including Syrians and Palestinians, with 80% of all people in Lebanon estimated to be living in poverty. The takeaway here: this is a compounding long-term economic crisis. The political class and the banking class are one and the same, and political reform and economic reform must come together. And this also is one of the reasons why when Lara was mentioning that people move to Qard al-Hassan, because it seems to escape these sort of official controls, financial and economic controls that go back to highly corrupt politicians. So finally here, and this is just, you can see this is taken in 2022. It's a survey of a year, and these are the results. Lebanese households in Lebanon and what their inability to pay for essentials. Next slide, please. So when discussing Lebanon, it's really important to remember that Lebanon is not just Lebanese. Lebanon is a highly diverse society, especially in forms of legal status. So I mean like citizenship and non-citizenship of several different legal categories that are also nationality-based and also labor-based. So it's important to remember here that Lebanon became an independent state only 5 years before the Nakba, when the Israeli state was created through the partition of Palestine and the forced displacement of over 750,000 of its Muslim and Christian inhabitants. Around 100,000 of them were displaced into Lebanon. And since then, Palestinians have been an integral part of Lebanese society. In many ways, national identity crystallized and fractured in relation to Palestinians. You know, I don't think this should be surprising. When we're allowed to have history, our histories are just as complex and contradictory as everyone else's. Intimacy, sameness, separation, union, difference, love, and violence and oppression structure this relationship. And as the late Lebanese novelist Ilyas Khouri wrote, every Arab is a Palestinian. Every poor man who carries a gun is a Palestinian. Palestine is the condition of us all. Today on paper, Palestinian refugees make about 7% of the country's total resident population, or population and then the residents a little lower. Next slide, please. I wanted to put these images next to each other because sometimes I think we don't think enough about how the Nakba and the Syrian war and refugee crisis are actually come together, and they evoke a lot of similar archives of memory, struggle, friction, love, living together, all of those things. I'm just gonna go over repeat a little bit what Lara said here. The Syrian uprisings and the subsequent war opened a new chapter for Lebanon. Hezbollah sent fighters to intervene militarily on the side of Bashar al-Assad's government in 2012. This decision really sent ripples through the party and the people, with intense disagreement among leadership and supporters. Since then, Hezbollah has been the most polarizing political party in Lebanon, at once the most popular and the most unpopular. It receives the most votes and the most cross-sectarian votes in parliamentary elections, and it's currently not in the majority camp. That's important. It was in the majority camp previous to the last elections. ISIS terrorist attacks on both army positions and civilian neighborhoods in Lebanon, in both north and on the border with Syria, and in the southern suburbs of Beirut in 2015. And if you know anything about Lebanon, the idea of a Salafi Takfiri group like ISIS really cuts across all sectors of society. The war in Syria led to the influx of about 1.5 million Syrian refugees into Lebanon. This rapid change in population put enormous strain on the already meager services provided by the state and has led to rising violence, anger, and bigotry against Syrian refugees. To date, about 1/3 of Lebanon's entire resident population are refugees from Arab countries fleeing wars. Sudan, Iraq, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanon is also home to over 1,000 migrant laborers and also of several different sort of legal statuses. Amidst all these crises, perhaps this is not surprising, there's been political paralysis. So there's been a presidential vacancy actually in the post for about 2 years. And the government has been in a caretaker capacity since 2021. This is important because if you think about anything structural that has to happen to the state, you need a presidential signature. So what that means is that a lot of the public services, public posts have been hollowed out because you just don't have that signature to push things through. So as it implemented a combination of the Gaza Dahi doctrine in Lebanon, the Israeli state continued its deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. It claims that the goal is to eliminate Hezbollah, and it's in similar ways to the claim that the goal in Gaza is to eliminate Hamas. But as it does with the Israeli genocide in Gaza and settler terrorism in the West Bank, the United States has maintained its support for Israeli aggression on Lebanon, on Syria, and in the broader region. This brings us to the army, and we can talk about this more, because we don't have a lot of time now, about the actual truce that was signed and what it actually demands of the Lebanese army, and what the Lebanese army can and can't do, and the relationship between the Lebanese army and its ability to defend Lebanon and vetoes placed on its armament by the United States. But it is very clear, especially that the only thing, and this is what we see with Syria today, done with American political, diplomatic, and military cover, the only thing allowed for Palestinians, Lebanese, and Syrians is to submit to the occupation of their lands and the ethnic cleansing of their people. The US-Israeli vision for armies in Syria and Lebanon is an internal police force and submission to Zionist occupation and de facto annexation. So just to end here, I want to return to the three scales that we began with at the beginning: national, regional, and international. And I think sometimes the domestic politics are left out of these conversations, because when you do actually talk about them, it's impossible to think of Hezbollah as an outside force or something that comes from outside of Lebanon. And indeed, the discourse that you can just remove Hezbollah from Lebanese society, where it is so deeply rooted, has genocidal implications, just as it does in in Gaza with Hamas. So it's critical to think about these scales to understand what and whom exactly are actually being targeted in Lebanon. People and material structures are not the only targets. The social fabric, already stretched thin, is being targeted. However, the social fabric has proved much more durable than Israel, the United States, and many Lebanese politicians chose to believe. And that is because I think it's the lived experience of actually making do without a functioning state and of assuming nefarious motives among politicians, in addition to lived experience of previous wars and Israeli invasion. That is actually what is holding Lebanon together. So just final slide. I want to just end on this photo, which is one of my favorite photos. I took it the summer before last. I went up to Neura with some friends. I have never swam on the beach there, so I was able to, and it's beautiful. And this is the remainder of the rail tracks that go from Beirut to Haifa, which is part of a longer railroad, of course, that doesn't exist anymore. Right now, the tracks, you can see they run actually into a concrete wall on the other side that's been blocked up. So I just wanted to end on this photo to remind people that the borders are relatively young, but very arrogant. And, we have been together and we will continue to be together. And I'll end there. So, thanks.
So I just want to ask all of our panelists about some more recent events. In the immediate aftermath of the ceasefire, the main view among Hezbollah and its supporters was that this was a victory, and the Secretary General Naim Qassem had said that this was a larger victory than what had occurred in 2006. Now that the ceasefire remains in place with Israel still maneuvering and still preventing people from returning, and with Syria having fallen so quickly and that offensive starting only hours after the ceasefire took effect, can this still be considered a victory, or at least of that scale, or is this just a reductive lens to look through, the idea of a victory or a loss?
I'll start, and then I will hope that my friends chime in. I think one of the I don't speak for everybody. I think one of the reasons I hesitated is because I think it depends on the level at which you're asking the question. It's not a sort of yes or no question, right? If we're stuck on the metric for victory is that Israel did or did not meet its goals, then sure, it did not meet its goals. That remains clear. But I don't think if we're actually talking about, and that I think when Naim Qassem is speaking, that's what he's talking about, right? He's speaking in the realm of political rhetoric among that, his audience is the realm of political rhetoric. But I think if we're talking about people and impact, I mean, the question of whether something was a victory or not is not the right question, I think, right? I mean, I think we need, if we're thinking about the costs in lives, in damage, in destruction, yeah, I don't think that that's the language that it makes sense to think about the context and to think about the moment that we're in. We also still don't know what's going to happen. I think that's the other piece of this, is that we are right now in a moment of a lot of unknowns. And I think a lot of us are, we're waiting to see how things play out regionally, because there are a lot of questions right now. There are far more questions than I think there are answers.
And I just want to add that I have a worry that this truce, the 60-day truce, is an opportunity actually for Israel to achieve some of its goals in South Lebanon by continuing to create a de facto DMZ zone, but, erasing entire villages, towns, and now it has a 60-day period where it's not being hit while it's doing some of these things. So it's a little complicated, right? I mean, in addition to sort of just the question of what does victory look like amid destruction for people who are actually living through these wars? I'm an anthropologist. Lara and I are anthropologists, so our framework is always grounded in people's experiences and how they understand, what politics actually means, political discourse actually means in practice. So I endorse everything Lara said and that Ziad thumbs up to, with the addition of this 60-day caveat of I'm not sure what's happening, and that it might be a way to actually achieve some of these goals.
I apologize if this question is also not easy. So, I mean, with the recent fall of the Syrian government, Hezbollah had intervened in 2013 on the basis that the supply lines to the Palestinians and to them needed to be protected. And now the supply lines are cut. Do you think that this will be a significant detriment to Hezbollah in the future? Do you think that it's possible that they can build some sort of domestic manufacturing base like Hamas was able to do? Or is that something that it's asking too much to predict in the future?
So I'm going to jump in, and though I'm not going to predict the future, there is no doubt that the fall of the Assad regime is a strategic and other types of blow to Hezbollah. And that's not because some purported democratic regime emerging in Syria is going to be a threat to Hezbollah. It's because, as we've already seen, the future is already being shaped by Israel publicly destroying the entire naval fleet, all aircrafts and helicopters and Air Force bases, and major stockpiles of weapons and major military bases across Syria. Not to mention occupying additional Syrian territory, including territory that further encircles southern Lebanon and territories that Hezbollah operates out of. So that is definitely a major blow. And that is one of the things many people had been concerned about by trying to separate the cause of domestic politics in Syria from the regional cause. And we're yet to see how that's going to play out. So it's definitely a blow. But I also think this idea that some pundits have been purporting that Hezbollah is done for, is over, is a total misreading of the situation. And I don't say that because there's some destined victory of Hezbollah. I just think that's a misreading of the landscape and of the way that Hezbollah operates. The dust needs to settle on these regional transformations, and we'll see what happens. And I think that's what everybody's waiting to see.
I agree with everything Ziad just said, and I think I would add two things. One, I mean, obviously Hezbollah is not just the military resistance, and I think that the ways in which the party moves forward from this moment internally in Lebanon are also going to impact what the fall of the Assad regime means for the party. And we just don't know the answer to that yet, but that's sort of one of the things that's still playing out. And I also think that it's like the comparison to Hamas, you know, the scale and sophistication of weaponry can't really be compared. Like, I think that's something we need to keep in mind too. Like, so Hezbollah has been able to build a particular kind of arsenal, in part due to that relationship and that land channel through Syria. And that obviously has been deeply threatened right now. But that was one particular kind of military resistance. And I don't think the Hezbollah military resistance and the Hamas military resistance are really comparable sort of infrastructurally in any way right now. And so that's also something to keep in mind as we think about what the future looks like. I mean, also the contexts are radically different, right?
I would just add that it's impossible to control the Lebanon-Syria border. It's important to remember that. This is a border that, I mean, really good luck. It's not even demarcated everywhere. There are cities sort of going in. There are villages that are split. There's, very sophisticated, like sort of micro societies built around these borders and border crossings. So I think that we shouldn't imagine that this is like no border can be sealed. This is impossible here and there. These are fantasies that we are just supposed to project forever securitization and invest money into a fantasy that is impossible to actually materialize fully. And then the other thing is that, it's not just, the relationship here is not just one of weaponry. There are many flows that went in between. I mean, it's impossible to imagine Lebanon without Syria and Syria without Lebanon for historical reasons, but also sort of lived reasons and structural reasons. So one of the reasons why there was why there was a big banking problem is in fact that a lot of the money from the Syrian regime went into Lebanese banks after having placed sanctions on them. So what's flowing in and out is many different sorts of currencies. And it's important, I think, to keep an eye on that. So, and people, obviously, have been flowing in and out. And I always thought about Lebanon before the 2019 as kind of the little country that could outrun, the little country that was outrunning everything that had been collapsing around it, namely Syria. And it really was a phenomenon to think about how Lebanon could not collapse as Syria collapsed. One of the reasons it didn't collapse is that it took many of the resources flowed into Lebanon from Syria. And that's also something to think about.
Can I add just one more thing? Sorry. Again, with the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime, as my colleague Bassam Haddad said in a teach-in recently, we have more questions than we have answers. But one of the things that has come to light, including some documents that purport some kind of coordination between the Assad regime, Russia, and Israel in the past several years about what weapons can move around Syria and what weapons can't. It's quite possible that a lot of the movement has already stopped before the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime, given the repeated strikes by Israel and the purported documentation that there was some kind of agreement that you need to not allow this stuff to move or else. And the kinds of frustrations that apparently were being expressed or have come to the surface that Iran and Hezbollah had with Assad for a variety of reasons, including not reaching some kind of détente with the opposition months, if not years ago. So I also want to say that part of it is to see what's going to happen in the future, but part of it is to actually fully take stock and understand what just happened and what was the last year actually like. And that'll also matter for thinking forward.
So I was told at the beginning of this that we're on a bit of an expedited timeline, so I'm going to push it to questions from the audience now. We'll do this in sets of 3 and 4. Just remember, please, have it be a question. Be concise. If you are here to disagree with me or any of the panelists, please don't yell. I cannot emphasize this. I've seen this happen multiple times before. Yeah, so
Hello.
does anybody have a question at all?
Let's see
one
hands.
hand, I see 2 hands.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm Nolan Benson. I teach history up at City College. I just want to ask a kind of more specific version of something I feel people were talking about a moment ago. Does it make sense to think that it is because Hezbollah was crippled by Israel's vicious military that Assad's regime just suddenly fell? Maybe there's no answers, I understand, but does that even have any kind of logic to it at all from what y'all know?
Good evening. To what degree must the defeat in southern Lebanon, and I think we must categorize it as a defeat, to what degree do we feel that will affect the popularity of Hezbollah in Lebanon in the coming years? And given the collapse in legitimacy of the existing political system, has that opened up avenues for new political movements, even left-wing secular movements, or any other less pleasant kind?
One of the other reasons we wanted to have this conversation was to think about our organizing efforts in the anti-war working group and to really think about how to organize in 2025 in the new realities of a Trump administration. So again, no one has a crystal ball, but thoughts on what a Trump administration will mean for Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, and how that affects organizing.
Military assets. I think the diversion of military assets from their original intention in Syria was absolutely part of it. It wasn't the main part of it. It wasn't the entirety of it, but it was certainly part of it. Yeah, I mean, Hezbollah did not have the political capital that it could expend again to do another major intervention in Syria, though it also, there were reports that Iran had come to Syrian officials and had said, there are all these internal issues that you're suffering and the rebels are planning another offensive and you should prepare for it, and they just flat out rejected it. So it may not have mattered in that respect. And also Russia, as a much larger military, was very much tied up in Ukraine to the point that the assets that it maintained in places like Tartus on the Mediterranean course did not really seem to matter. And when the foreign minister was in Qatar and was questioned about this, he accused the moderator of trying to drown him in Syria. This is not the priority that it was, back in the 2010s. And like I was saying, no political capital to expend to defend it, and that's part of it. Could someone else speak to the popularity of different movements?
Yeah. I mean, maybe Lara and Maya could speak to that. I just want to say that there was a teach-in hosted by Jadaliya and partners featuring Bassam Haddad and Omar Dahi, hosted by Noor Ariat and Mu'in Rabbani, that dealt with this question quite intensely. And I think, one of the things to keep in mind is, yes, there's the question of Hezbollah or Iran's ability or available capital, political or otherwise, to intervene on the side of Bashar al-Assad. But I think it's really important to note that neither Russia, neither Hezbollah, neither Iran intervened, and that the Syrian regime of 2013, 2014, 2015 that seemed worth intervening, where the regime itself played a leading force on the ground, is not the regime that was in place in 2023, 2024, right? And there are a whole host of socioeconomic and political economy reasons for this, separate from whatever changed for Hezbollah, Iran, and this. So I think the answer to the question has to combine the supporters of the regime not coming to its aid and why they did that, but also how the regime has been fundamentally hollowed out as a result of a whole set of practices that people who work on Syria are far more articulate to speak to this issue. I have something to say about the Donald Trump administration, but I want to make sure we answer the popularity question first and the other issues.
So I think that Hezbollah suffered many big hits and some defeats. I think, also we have to remember at its core what Hezbollah is. And at its core, Hezbollah is a movement to defend the South from repeated, totally Israeli incursions, wars, colonizations, resources, all those things with complete impunity. So you have to sort of gauge, I think, what comes out from now, based on many different factors, many different parts of Hezbollah also, the sort of political, social networks, and also the armed movement. But I think even when we talk about defeat, it's really important to note here that Israel was not able to advance in the South as it wanted to, because people were fighting tooth and nail. And they were fighting because they were fighting for their homes and for their people and for their country, and informed by the absolute terror of what Israel has been allowed to do for the last year in Palestine, and also the archive of what it's been allowed to do since its founding in Lebanon, right? So I even think the language of defeat, we just need to also recognize that people fought and lost their lives, and they were successful in repelling and not allowing Israel to do whatever the hell it wanted in the South. And I think that is one of the things we can see a difference between Syria and Lebanon, right? For sure, if people hadn't been fighting, Israel would, of course, reached Beirut. Right? I mean, there's no doubt it would have reached Beirut and maybe beyond if it had wanted to. So it's I just want to note that, right? That even when we speak of defeats or weaknesses, we have to recognize the successes, the strength, the entrenchment, and the sort of looking ahead. What this will look like is, so now the Lebanese state has been given a mandate. The Lebanese army has been given a mandate by both external powers and also internally, locally. And, you know, if the Lebanese army can defend the south, and let's not forget, parts of Lebanon are still occupied, so it's not only about defending from further occupation, we actually have occupied territories that we have to deal with. You know, great, but people will fight, are gonna fight. So if the Lebanese army can't do it, there will be resistance. That's just the way that, you know, people don't submit. No matter what the fantasy of submission is, people don't submit, and they won't submit. And I think we just have to remember that.
I agree with what Maya just said, and I want to add a couple other things, which is to go back to what I was saying before about how there are all of those many reasons that people support Hezbollah, and all those reasons still stand, right? So it's the resistance. It's also many other things, right? It's deeply imbricated in Lebanese society as a political party, as a social network, and as resistance. And then the other thing is, I think we can also look to 2006 and the aftermath of the 2006 war as an example, where there were people who were saying the 2006 war is a defeat. Look, look at the destruction. And the party's popularity grew in that moment. And obviously, there are many differences between 2006 and now as well, but I think it does work as somewhat of an analogy. So I think we are going to continue to see Hezbollah be both the most popular and the least popular political party, depending on who you ask. And then I guess since since my mic is on, I'm going to jump to the third question, to Max's question about the organizing. And I guess one thing I want to say that isn't exactly what you asked, but I'm going to bring it into this conversation, is I think we need to be braced and ready and need organizing to be happening to allow us to continue to have these kinds of conversations in the United States, right? So even before Trump takes office, we have examples like that legislation that just passed in the House that would make it possible, if it passes, it didn't pass in the Senate this time, but it may well, it could, that would make it possible for basically anyone to decide as an act of fiat to equate a group in the US with material support of terrorism and remove their 5013 status, right? Like, so that law would actually, if it actually passes, could potentially allow a group to say, oh, look, that organization that has 5013 status seems to support Palestinian rights. We're going to remove that 5013 status on the grounds that that is actually now supporting terrorism. It opens up that kind of space. And again, that's happening under Biden. It didn't pass under Biden, but I imagine that that kind of legislation is going to emerge more aggressively under Trump. It is possible that we'll see BDS, for example, banned at the federal level. That's something. The rolling back of free speech rights that we're seeing on college campuses, I think that's something we need to be paying attention to. And again, this isn't exactly what you asked, but I think this is a place that we also, it's all related, right? Like you can't fight settler colonialism and imperialism, and we can't be pushing towards an anti-imperialist, anti-war organizing without the space and capacity and ability to be able to do that in the US also. And so I think that has to be part of the question, is how do we keep that space as the Trump regime takes power.
Can I just add to follow up, and I really appreciated what Maya and Lara said about Hezbollah in Lebanon, and I just, for that, I would just add to the fact that we are yet to see the full ramifications of what Hezbollah did for the last year internally within Israel, and the kind of internal fissures and debates that have emerged as a result of Hezbollah's ability to sustain a year-long support front. But we'll see. But with regards to the Trump administration, I would definitely echo Lara's point that we, in terms of political organizing, we need to come to the defense of the spaces and the people that are already doing the kind of hard work. And to be honest, I expected a lot more support for the student activism that happened last year. from various sectors of the political spectrum in the United States and the progressive, and there were reasons why some groups just lifted their hands up or didn't want to say too much about this student group or that student group because they didn't like what this student group was saying or how it said it. At the end of the day, a blow to any of those student groups was a blow to all student groups and to all of us in our organizing efforts, and we're going to see the ramifications of that. So we need to be much more diligent. I think as an anti-war organizing or as an anti-imperialist organizing, we need to not wait for the kind of wars that fit a certain framework and narrative to be opposed on anti-war grounds. The United States is already engaging in a process and a long-term warfare against recalcitrant groups and resistance groups in the region. I suspect they will take advantage of Bashar al-Assad's fall to kind of strangle Hezbollah and strangle Iran in various ways, including ramping up economic sanctions and other forms. And I think we need to be just as, and we know that the way they do that is not just to siphon resources away from these regimes, but to actually punish the people and the constituencies that support these regimes and these groups. So I think we need to be very diligent about having an anti-war strategy and an anti-imperialist strategy that isn't waiting for another Iraq 2003, or is it simply waiting for airstrikes to be opposed, but is actually opposed to the very principle of an ongoing war against any and all forms of alternatives to submission, as Maya put it earlier. And I think that's going to be really important. And it doesn't need to wait for the Trump administration. This administration's behavior in Lebanon has been absolutely disgusting. And it's paving the way for Trump to claim that he is continuing what was begun and simply doing it better. And I think we shouldn't wait for Inauguration Day for that movement to kick off and for that organizing to kick off, just to be clear.
On this, I think it's really important to remember Hannah Arendt's warning that the relationship between democracy and undemocracy, or democracy, totalitarianism, fascism, is not a binary, it's a spectrum. And you really see that spectrum come to alive when there's consensus, an overlapping consensus over things that, or issues that that are just off limits, basically. Palestine is one of them. It's what reveals the spectrum in the United States. And this is, I think, also interesting for the left to learn, right? What are these points, actually? Because those are the points that then logically will weaken that spectrum, if that's what unites them and what brings it to fruition. I mean, I think that we are still learning the absolute, we should just, this is the worst administration for Palestine in history, the Biden administration. So a lot of people are like, oh, what comes next? I still want to talk about what's happening right now, right? There's like a month left, right? A month left. A lot can happen in a month, but it won't, because there is a bipartisan investment in this American imperial policy in the Middle East. It always has been. It will not change unless we make it change. And that's what we all sort of have to do. And then I just wanted to, because we didn't get to this, Lebanon has no shortage of political parties. I know we were talking about like secular parties, and there are many secular parties in Lebanon. Most of them are conservative, right-wing, centrist. And the uprising was one of these moments when you saw sort of a political effervescence. And I have no doubt that this will continue. And it always sort of goes up and down in waves. And in some ways, much more politically, it's really important. I really hope everyone learned in the United States a lesson that we know in Lebanon and in the entire region very well. Don't trust your governments. Don't, these are not, like, you have to approach power with skepticism. Above all. That's the only way that we can survive them together.
Before we jump to questions, I just want to say one short thing based on one of the things Maya just said, which is even around Palestine and the US, the consistency of US not only support for Israel, but suppression of any kind of activism around Palestine in the US. Daryl Lee, who's an anthropologist and a lawyer, has written about how, we often think about the war on terror and all the sort of post 2001 legislation and the Patriot Act and the banning of particular kinds of charitable organizations and the whole legal apparatus that came out of that as related to the events of 9/11, right? But he's actually pulled out how it's a lot of the root of much of that legislation goes back to efforts to suppress Palestine activism in the United States. And I think we really need to remember that has that effort, the effort to suppress any support for Palestinian liberation in the US has been underlying much of the other kinds of repressive acts of the US government for decades and decades and decades. And it's been the worst in this administration, and it continues to get worse and worse with every subsequent administration, right? Like that's what we've basically been seeing. So it's neither new, nor can we forget that even when people think it's not about Palestine, it's actually has been about Palestine at its core.
All right. That was fantastic. That was amazing. I want to hand it off to my comrade Mac to just say thank you to everyone.
We are going to continue the conversation informally, so if you didn't have a chance to ask questions, hopefully you all can stick around for a few minutes and we can all debrief and unpack this together. We just wanted to end with a few brief announcements about DSA and also our fundraiser. Tonight we're also fundraising for migrant workers who have been among the hardest hit by the war in Lebanon. If you didn't see this when you came in, there are QR codes in the back. We are fundraising for ARM, Anti-Resistance Movement. It's a really fantastic feminist grassroots organization. Sorry, what did I just? Oh, excuse me, Anti-Racism Movement. So Lara mentioned the $40 billion figure of infrastructural damage. The needs are so high right now in Lebanon across the board for so many people. So really these mutual aid fundraisers and things we can do, they do make a difference. And secondly, for DSA organizing, we have a anti-war working group strategy meeting on Tuesday, December 17th. There's also a nifty QR code for more information on that. But even better than a QR code, could you please raise your hand if you're in DSA? Raise it high, don't be shy. Awesome. If you are not in DSA and you are interested to learn more, please talk to folks, ask them about what we're up to. There is so much work to be done, and we are as strong as our numbers. From anti-war organizing to education, housing, environmental justice, there's many, many ways to get involved. And we are going to shift gears and continue the conversation over some baklava and tea in the back. But let's please give our gratitude to our panelists. Thank you so much. Political education is what makes our organizing better, so thank you again so much for your insights, analysis, and helping us think better.